Hi guys, how's it going? Ivano here, and today I want to talk about the easiest and then also consequently the hardest classes to master in this game, thinking about PvP of course. And I want to preface this because always when I make a tier list, there's always like one or two guys in the comments that say, but I play Operative and it's actually really hard to master because you can do all these cool mechanics. Alright. First of all, this is only my opinion. I certainly don't know everything about all of the classes in the game. And also this is mostly aimed at beginners who are maybe looking into what class they should pick to get into PvP and which of these classes is easy to learn. But at the same time, I don't want to put anyone off. If you're a new player and you want to try to play the hardest class in the game, go ahead and do it. I'm not telling you not to do it. I simply want to give a little bit of my experience of having played all of these classes in PvP, Warzones and Arena. And hopefully that can help someone pick their class. So before we get into it, I kept this pretty simple. I separated the specs by, DPS, Juggernaut, for example, and then the tanks. Of course, in the case of the healers, we have, the normal Sorcerer DPS and the heals. I did not go, each of the combat styles because I think a lot of the skills that you need to master will be the same, whether you're playing Madness or Lightning. So to keep it a little bit more simple, we're not going to rank all of the combat styles in the game. And of course, when I say Juggernaut, I also mean Guardian, because if you're a new player, the most important thing you should know is that between the Imperial side classes like the Juggernaut and the Republic side classes like the Guardian, these classes are basically mirrored, which just simply means that they have different animations and maybe the ability have different names, but basically they are the same class. So when I talk about Juggernaut DPS being relatively easy to learn, the same is true for the Guardian. And then finally, a general point. There's actually two different concepts here. The first being what sometimes is referred to as the skill floor. So what is kind of the minimum level of skill or knowledge that you need to have about the class to perform well in PvP, right? And maybe, let's say, get at least 80% of the performance that's possible with this class out of the class. And this would be the first example if we think about Juggernaut DPS, for example, whether you're playing Rage or Vengeance. They have pretty straightforward rotations. You have your classic builder-spender playstyle. You build up some rage, jump in the enemy's face, and then you spend your rage with something like a smash, for example. So something you would have seen in many other games, and really nothing too complicated. And this is what I talk about with skill floor. The class is relatively easy to learn and, let's say, do well on, but there's still a big difference between the best Juggernaut players on the server and someone who has just picked up the class. So one thing is the skill floor, the other thing is, let's say, the skill ceiling. If you're, let's say, the best Juggernaut player on the server, how high is, let's say, that difference between like a really good Jug and this beginner Jug that maybe does like 80%. And I would say for Juggernaut, the difference is big, but not that big. So Juggernaut has a lot of utility that takes a while to master. And in that way, it's also similar to some of the tanking disciplines in the game. You have, of course, your taunts, you have your intercede. But then one thing that differentiates the best Juggernauts from, let's say, the mediocre ones is also how often they use their leap. Leap, of course, being a very impactful ability for Juggernauts, gives them 20% damage reduction, also the CC immunity. And for me, the movement and kind of how they string together their abilities is really the hallmark of a good Jug. So I think Juggernaut, also because in PvP you don't really need to think so much about how to manage your resources. I think it's relatively easy to learn. There's definitely a mastery curve, but I would say Juggernaut DPS is on the side of the easier specs in the game. Now the same is not true for Juggernaut tanks. The damage rotation is pretty simple. You basically just taunt Crushing Blow, do 80k AoE DPS and auto DPS most of the damage classes in the game. That is relatively simple. The hard part when it comes to tanking is your positioning, is your taunting, and especially the guard swap. Now I see a lot of tank players that play tank simply for the reason, well, to be tanky, I guess this is the name, but basically because, maybe they are struggling to not die when they play Juggernaut DPS, so they decide to play a tank because, well, at least 1v1 you're basically unkillable as a tank, even with DPS gear. And Juggernaut tank, of course, is really strong like that, but you are kind of doing a team a disservice if you play that way, because new players, especially when they play tanks, kind of forget to use guard. And guard is actually, I would say at least, the most powerful ability in the game. So if you're not using that, if you're not swapping your guard to whoever is low at the moment, then you are not really using the full potential of that class. And you might be even losing your team the game because, maybe the opposite tank is guarding and guard swapping on every burst of the enemy PT. So tank for sure, if you want to play it properly, is actually a hard class, and I would even say is the hardest class in the game. So we will put that up here. Next we have PT. This one might be controversial, but as opposed to most people's belief, PT is actually not the easiest class in the game to master. I think PT DPS is one of the few specs in PvP where you still need to watch your resource, because you can overheat, and in that case, as a PT, if you don't have your vent heat ability ready, which has quite a long cooldown, you will actually do 0 damage. So you need to manage your heat, which I think out of the gate makes PT already a little bit harder to play than Jug, for example. Of course, the damage rotation, if we want to call it like that, is relatively simple. There's the meme with the 4-button Vanguard controller, and it's relatively easy to do a lot of damage on PT. It's one of those classes that kind of teaches you the fundamentals really well, because you don't have this get out of jail free button that maybe a Jug has with Reflect, or a Sorcerer has with Phase Walk and Barrier. On a PT, if you go in and you don't have Leap or Hydraulics ready, you are kind of a sitting duck and you're not getting out. So PT teaches you, first of all, to play around your cooldowns, and then second, also not to overextend. And this is something that many DPS players need to learn. But once you have those basics down, yeah, there are still things you can learn to master. There are things like the pull Carbonize combo, how to properly AoE, how to use your taunts. And for the reasons that I already mentioned, on PT, it is especially important to use your defensive cooldowns properly. And on the offensive side, kind of how you stack your burst cooldowns when you use them, how not to waste your explosive fuel, are all little things you can do. Of course, I might be slightly biased because this is my main class, but I think that PT is actually harder to play at a decent level compared to Jug, so I will put it in average tier. PT tank, on the other hand, is definitely easier to play than Jug tank, simply because the damage rotation of PT tank is kind of just 2 buttons, maybe 3 if you're being generous. And that means you have a lot more time to think about your utility, think about your guard swap and your taunt. It's still a tank, so you still need to kind of compromise between doing damage and swapping guard on the right people in the right moment. So I definitely wouldn't say it's easy to play, but it's also not one of the hardest specs in the game, let's be real. I will put it in average tier for that reason. Next we have Sin DPS, and Sin DPS, I would say, has a pretty high skill floor, because you need to learn the proper opener combos, and if you mess them up, your target pops some cooldown, then your burst is kind of completely ruined. The other thing with Sin is that it can get kited a lot, because again, you're using your Shadowcraft, you're using your Phantom Stride in the opener. This is one of your 2 mobility abilities, and once that is down, Sin can be a sitting duck. So it's definitely not one of the easiest classes to play in the game. You can play Sin in a way that once you're in fight, you just try to stick on a target somehow and always hit the glowing buttons, and then it's relatively average to play. I would say not the easiest, because once you learn the opener combo, by the way, check my Deception Assassin masterclass on that one. Like once you have that combo kind of down, you kind of have almost like a flowchart that you can follow. A lot of the things fall into place, but for sure there is a big difference between like a really good Sin and a beginner Sin. So personally, I would say Sin for sure is harder to play than maybe something like PT, but it's not quite on the level of a Jug tank. Okay, next we have Sin tank. Now Sin tank is, when it comes to doing damage at least, relatively simple. You look for the biggest AoE stack that you can find. You spam Wither, Discharge and Depredating Walls and do 20k DPS easy, while also resetting your taunt every couple of seconds. That part is not so hard. But then you kind of do need to keep your Dark Ward stacks up. You are tanks, so you need to taunt the right targets on the enemy team. Need to swap your guard, and of course you do have stealth. You can also use pull, so there's quite a lot of skills that you can work on when playing Shadow Tank. And I think simply for the reason that it's a tank, I would put it in the advanced category. Next we have Operative DPS, which is also one of those classes that, a bad operative can just kind of roll around and you can never really kill them because, they don't take any damage during the roll in case of concealment. And lethality simply has 5 lives and 80 seconds of evasion, it feels like. Difference between the bad one and the good one is quite big though. So I would put them in a similar category to Sin. I would say they are difficult to play. Not just because in the case of concealment, they have some of the similar flaws as the assassin, for example. So they can get rooted easily and they're not the best in a team fight. But there are a lot of combos you can do, combos you can learn. Of course, there's the whole dimension of objective play, the whole zap capping thing. Doing damage itself is probably not that hard, to be honest. But when you play against a really good concealment, especially 1v1, you will see that there are a lot of little things that they do when it comes to how they anticipate your damage, for example, and then roll just in the right moment to completely avoid it. And I would say just learning that means you need to learn all the other classes in the game and how they want to do damage. So Operative, to play it properly, probably one of the more difficult specs in the game. Operative heal in itself, I would say it's not that hard to learn. You can play it in a way that you simply keep hots on everyone, and then when anyone hits you and you don't have guard, you die. That is probably not the optimal way to play the class, I'm sure. So the skill ceiling is relatively high because you always need to look out for what could be killing you. You don't have any really hard defensive cooldowns outside of Vanish, of course. So you need to have relatively good positioning. The healing itself is not the hardest. Probably the hardest is not to let your hots fall off. I would say it is a little bit more difficult compared to the other healers. So I will put it in difficult tier. Next we have Sorcerer DPS. So here, of course, this is Madness and Lightning. Madness, of course, is a very beginner-friendly spec to play. Both of those specs also virtually need no resource management. You have your force, and unless you do something crazy, the rotations are basically self-sustaining, so you can simply hit the enemies and you will never really run out of force, at least in PvP. Doing damage then is also relatively simple, and the hard part when it comes to Sorc really is how you use your utility. So stunning the right targets, knockbacking the right targets, at the same time not fucking up your team if they have a good AoE stack. And then another thing is how you use your pull. So that's your friendly pull. You can save a teammate, but you can also troll them if you use it in the wrong moment. Actually, Sorcs are excellent at trolling other Sorcs by pulling them out of barrier. So I would say they definitely have some skill cap. Also when it comes to positioning and such. That's probably the biggest difference, I would say, between like a really good Sorc and an average Sorc. A good Sorc is just almost unkillable, and an average Sorc is probably the easiest target to kill in the game because of how squishy they are. And if you forget to use your defensives, then you get simply one shot, right? So overall, it depends. But I would say Sorcerer DPS can be somewhere in the average category. Now Sorc heal, especially when compared to Operative heal, I think is quite straightforward to play. Once you get used to the different force banding effects, that's probably like the hardest thing to learn when you're just starting out with the class. Otherwise, it's relatively simple. You put barrier on people, keep your big AoE heals on cooldown, and then use Innervate to regenerate your force. You do need to be a bit careful not to run out of force, which will drop your healing to near zero. So some resource management is required, which I would say probably makes it a bit harder to play than Sorcerer DPS, but it's definitely not as hard to play as an Operative heal, because there isn't really any hots you need to keep up. You kind of just can play it in a way that you triage heal, look whoever is low, and just press some green buttons on them. Defensively also, it's of course very strong. You can kite a lot, you have good cooldowns. So it's not that reliant on great positioning as maybe some of the other healers. So I would put it in average tier. Merc DPS. Now to be honest about this one, I'm not quite sure. I think Merc for sure, especially when you look at Arsenal, is probably like one of the easiest classes to learn, which is why they're so popular. Defensive cooldowns are really straightforward. It is quite hard to overheat compared to PT, for example. I personally find that the energy management is easier, and then the rotation is also not that complicated. Maybe in this case we need to differentiate between Arsenal and IO actually, because Arsenal, you know, the rotation is really just you reset your blazing bolts, spam some tracer missiles here and there, and then just kind of hit whatever glows kind of thing. So for me, for sure, Arsenal is in the easiest category, even though there are a lot of things you can do with properly using your concussion missile, using the net at the right moments. But yeah, apart from that, there's not too much you can really do on Arsenal. So I personally would put that in the easiest category. If you're playing IO Merc, so that's Innovative Ordnance, the rotation is a little bit more complicated. Not that much. I mean, you also have your proc that's very similar to how APPT procs the rail shot. You do have a lot of buttons that you're regularly using in your rotation. and you do need to look out a little bit more for your resource management. So maybe I would put this one in the average category just because it can take a while until you really learn how to do damage with it. But it's also not one of the craziest specs in the game, personally, I think. Merc Heal, on the other hand, is, in my opinion, really easy to learn, and a class I would definitely recommend if you are looking how to get to healing. The cooldowns are just the same as on all of the other mercs, really straightforward. One of them heals you, the other one reflects damage, and the next one is just a shield. You do need a bit of heat management, so I'm probably not going to put this in the easiest tier, because you can overheat, so from time to time you need to use your rapid shot. Or I guess counter shot is called on the heal. Because you have so many strong defensives and you can of course also heal yourself, you don't really need to have the best positioning as, you know, maybe on operative heal. Healing itself then, let's say your rotation, is also quite straightforward. So if you're looking to learn a healer, I would look at Bodyguard Mercenary. Finally, we have the pure DPS specs, Marauder and Sniper, which I think are actually, now that I think about it, probably in a similar boat. Because I would say the skill floor is relatively low, but then the skill cap on the other end is relatively high. And what do I mean with that is, you know, that just to learn, let's say, Fury Marauder or even Carnage and Annihilation, how to press the buttons and maybe do 10k DPS is relatively simple. And the same is actually true for the sniper specs. But, you know, then you have Marauders and also snipers that can do 20k DPS, so do twice as well, basically. And to get there takes a lot more skill, especially if you look at something like a marksman sniper, which is not in the best spot right now in PvP, but there are still some players that can do crazy things with it and that you never want to have on the enemy team. So for sure, I think both are like easy to learn, hard to master specs. Marauder used to have like more things you could do with Obfuscate, for example. Used to have a lot more utility in previous patches. Now that's not really a thing. Just for that reason, I will maybe put it in difficult tier, so not quite as hard as the tanks. There are still a lot of mechanics you can do on Marauder that, you know, maybe only some of the most experienced players will know about. But at the same time, if you're a new player looking to get into the game, Marauder is definitely something that you can try. And for the Sniper, now that I think about it, I will take back what I said before. Because if I think about Sniper, probably the skill floor, like in general, is actually not the lowest. Because the thing with Sniper is that, I mean, first of all, I see a lot of snipers in PvP that don't even use cover, which is probably the most important thing that a sniper has, because it gives you all these beneficial effects, makes it so you can't get CC'd, pulled, and so on. So from a skill floor perspective, yeah, you should be using cover, and it's not like it's super hard, but it's still like something that's unique to the class, and that maybe if you're coming from something like an Arsenal Mercenary, you might need to get used to. But if you're not using it, the class is quite useless, because you can be relatively squishy, and the class is literally designed around being in cover 35 meters away with the longest range in the game, and then just free casting on people while being also CC immune, right? And if you're not using that, then the class is not all that good. At the same time, it can die to burst, and you need to use your cooldowns proactively, so something like rolling a thermal detonator. But of course, if you're a new player, again, talking about skill floor, and you don't even know that, you know, PT wants to one-shot you with thermal detonator, double energy burst, then you don't see that coming, you don't roll it, and you get one shot. So I would say Sniper for sure, the skill floor is relatively high. And then when it comes to mastery, again, I'll just repeat what I said earlier. There is a big difference between an average sniper and one of the really good snipers on the enemy team. Because a good one will just kite you for days, they will keep you rooted permanently, and you can never really jump to them, and they will just make you want to uninstall the game. So I think when it comes to DPS classes, and we're talking about hardest to master, I would put Sniper up here in the advanced tier. Again, it doesn't mean that you cannot try it if you're a new player, but make sure that you check out one of my sniper guides, so at least you learn the basics. So that's all I had for today, guys. Let me know in the comments what you think about this list. Do you disagree? Would you have the classes the other way around? Put it in the comments. And as always, if you enjoyed this one, please remember to leave it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.